Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jérôme CHAPUIS. I'm the chief editor at the newspaper La Croix, with partner of Les Rencontres Économiques, and I will be the moderator until 6:50 p.m. The session that we call for passionate yet serene political debate. And for this, I have with me a member of the Cercle des économistes, Alain TRANNOY. You're in Marseille. You're a professor at the School of Economics. And you're a scientific advisor to France Stratégie. Before handing over the floor, Alain, I will introduce our 5 guests with me in the studio of the Maison de la Radio. Dominique SCHNAPPER. Hi, Dominique. You're a social scientist, director of studies at the EHESS. Good morning, Olivier DUHAMEL. You're the president of the National Foundation of Political Science, well known by the auditors of Europe 1, director of the review magazine Power, LEBLANC. He's the director of Aon France, Robert LeBlanc, CEO and chairman. And you, we are also in line with Mexico with Marina Robles GARCIA. Hello, Marina Robles GARCIA. Hi. We're honored to have you with us. You're the Secretary of the Environment, the government of the City of Mexico. Closer to us, but we have Hervé SCHIAVETTI, the mayor of Arles. Hi, Hervé. This is your 3rd mandate. You decided not to run for office. And you're still the mayor for a few days. Yes, this afternoon I'm in Marseille, and tomorrow I'll be in Arles, and I'll leave my office. So thank you for being with us after these 3 mandates. You were running with the Communist Party. So thank you very much for being us. So I hand over the floor to Alain TRANNOY so that he proposes some introduction for our discussion. We hope they will be serene and passionate. Hello, everybody. So I think we'll have a quiet debate, a serene debate. But there's one thing that brings us together is the fact that there's a feeling that violent discourse has reappeared in the public debate. And the first question is to know whether all the participants agree that this is a phenomenon of this resurgence of violence in the debates. And the second topic is, of course, to know, or a question is to know if we can identify reasons that could explain the renewal of the violence in the public debate. And so I come from a port city, Marseille, and I would like to use the metaphor of the mutiny on a ship to say that the Yellow Jacket movement was a mutiny, in fact, with a view to the direction the ship of France was taking. And maybe there were 2 things that justify a mutiny. First of all, a feeling of injustice on behalf of the crew. And secondly, the feeling that the captain is going to cause a wreck. And so with this metaphor, it seems that we could distinguish 2 reasons related to this injustice, related to the reason of this injustice, social, economical, and injustice that could give rise to this ire, to this, and that, yes. So, as far as the injustice is concerned, it seems that there is a strong return of the social issues in France following the economic crisis of 2008. Obviously, there's a lot of insatisfaction because of inequalities, but the discourse on inequality is much more present, has been much more present the last 10 years. And the debate is more acute, let's say, and more violent on these issues. Whereas when we look at the different data of the polls on inequality, on poverty, we don't really see large movements. It's globally stable, and if we compare France to other European countries, we see that we are rather among the good students, if I can say so, regarding poverty. We're among the 5 countries where the poverty rate is the lowest in Europe. So what can explain this gap between the statistics and what the political debate reveals? Well, it would seem that we should take into account the fact that the growth rate of the level of life of the looks more like the 19th century than the 20th century and the wars. And when the share of cakes doesn't increase, well, then you look at the relative part. So the so we have a game that's with a negative result, or summing up. Anyway, so there's a question that is really Franco-French related to the feeling of injustice as to the political representation, where with a relative majority in voices in the elections, sometimes very short, the poll system creates a majority in the assembly, and so there's this feeling of being cheated. And to this you should add, in more depth, sociologically speaking, the fact that the more popular layers of the population don't feel they are properly represented in the assembly. So once we've looked at injustice, we must look at the direction the ship is taken. Obviously, there's a lot of worries. People are worried on climate warming, the loss of biodiversity, the fact that the economy is destroying the planet, not only for our generations, but chiefly for future generations, and a feeling with the younger generations, the fact that the capitalist system that had won the competition between the different economic systems was, especially following the fall of the Berlin Wall until the crisis of 2008. So for 20 years, it really seemed like the system that had taken the lead, and now it's contested by the younger generation. The fact that we want to consume more to become wealthier, and so the younger generation make it responsible for the destruction of the planet. So to these reasons, we should add, maybe, I don't have an answer, the fact that, or a questioning on the role of social networks, the social media. Are social networks, are they a sounding board of all these worries, these fears that can turn into hatred? Or are the social networks a driving force in the distribution, the diffusion, or dissemination of these violent discourses? So this is what I propose as a basis for our discussion. And we can eventually use these points to start our debate. So thank you. Thank you, Alain TRANNOY. So back on the social issue, the question of political representation, the anxiety with the environmental issues, and social networks. Of course, I propose that we all take a few minutes to share your vision, to try to explain why this feeling of the degradation of, or the downgrade of the public discourse. So I roughly agree with what my colleague of the EHESS said on the deregulations, or the. So I'd like to go over what seems to me to be at the heart of all these
deregulations.
because when we talk about the crisis, of political representativity, it's the crisis of the republic. In fact, we've never encountered in history the fact that we only knew a representative republic. So once the great principles of representations are put in question, it's the republic itself that is in crisis and that is threatened. So we all know that the successes of Mrs. Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, is to have been elected with 17 or 18% of the voters, and Mrs. Aubry kept her post with 12 to 13% of votes. Of voters, so very few voters. So what's serious in the abstention is that it's through the voting system that the institutions that organize the republic are made legitimate and give it its full meaning. If we don't no longer accept that, we don't no longer accept the legitimacy of governments elected in free elections in the respect of the state of right and public freedoms, it's or a state of law, for example. It's the questioning. We put in question the republic as it functions. I'm a universalist. I think all the people have a natural vocation to freedom, but few of them have learned to respect the institutions that organize this freedom. So once there's the people do not vote, once the legitimacy of those who are freely elected is put in question immediately. And so it's really the institutional mechanism through which there is a crisis of democracy. There was a book from two American politicians that described the death of democracies, that showed that what leads to the disappearance of democracy starts with a certain level of violence and then a level of hatred. Violence is the moment when democracies organize their own criticism. The right to strike, for example, is in the French Constitution. It's once the criticism steers clear from institutional frameworks. And hatred is the moment when the political adversaries are transformed into enemies. And there, democracy lies on the idea that a loyal competition for the positions in the government lie on a common conception that make the others competitors and not enemies. And so I would like just to remind you that the largest historical democracy, the United States, as when there was the election 4 years ago, when President Trump was elected against Mrs. Clinton, put in question this conception of the respectable competitor as such, because he endlessly questioned his honesty, and he said beforehand that if she was elected, it's because there was a fraud. So in this very precise example, well, Trump shows us as a caricature the risks that exist in all democracies. So he pays a service because he gives the example. And so his example, in my opinion, is a good example of this questioning of the principles based on which democracy functions. Because by crystallizing hatred as a mean, as a kind of relationship between, a type of relationship between political adversaries and the partisan character with a lot of hostility. And the hostility that we see in the United States, when you think that there's always a collaboration between different parties, and a good example of the risks that we encounter when hatred and violence, the risk that hatred and violence replace the democratic hypocrisy, which is essential to democracy. Thank you very much, Dominique Schnapper. Olivier DUHAMEL, in a few minutes, on the basis of the keys that were proposed by Alain TRANNOY. Yes, I agree with everything that's been said until now, and I'll try to continue in line with what Dominique Schnapper just developed. I think that it's very difficult in France and elsewhere also maybe more so in France. It's difficult in France, and certainly in the United States also, and in a certain number of other countries, to have a passionate but yet serene political debate because of the rise of populism. I think populism generates an hyper-passionate debate that cannot be made serene and turned peaceful. And why? Before developing the 2 or 3 points that in the essence of populism make the peaceful debate impossible, I would like to first say that the media system is subject to populist pressure that is impossible to avoid. There's a kind of rationale or logic that not in the comment, not in the value. Nobody says, you know, that Le Pen is fantastic or Trump is wonderful. No, it's not that. Nobody says that, but it's all the logics of l'audimat, all the ratings of the radios or television or the media, you know, encourage this phenomenon of hatred. And to go back, to use the words of Dominique, the more there's violence, the more there's hatred, the better it is, even though we think it's bad. But it's the polls, it's the audience ratings. It's the logic of the system that is bad here. So why is populism specifically a barrage or a wall or a barrier that is blocks everything, blocks the passionate debate? Because it's the first time in history that participants in the public debate and who has a pretension to access to power openly leave aside the truth. The truth is absolutely of no importance. Fake news or not, you know, Trump also has a model, uses a model. And again, I agree with Dominique Schnapper, and more so because I hadn't thought of that, and that annoys me. I didn't think about that at first. Trump is interesting because he demonstrates a caricature. He demonstrates the risks we may be confronted to when we defend democracy. He's a model in the kind. Secondly, the populism is against the experts or elite and the experts of knowledge, for example. And when you're denouncing knowledge, you can't have a public debate on the policies to defend it. If you evacuate or if you refuse to accept an expertise in knowledge or something like that. And so is when you have representatives of the elite that denounce the elite. That's the worst case figure. It exists. And thirdly, what is in line with what I said is the fact that there is a refusal of reason. We deny reason. We have passionate debate, but serene debate. Well, no. The debate shouldn't be serene. It should be passionate, full stop. It's in the excess of passion. It needs to work on emotions. And that's why the wonderful article on Trump from a Swiss professor, saying that with Trump, it's the first time that we have exactly the model of reality shows in power. And shows Trump is exactly that. Everything is based on emotions. And obviously emotions have already existed in politics. Obviously a good politician must be combine reason and emotions. But the complete evacuation of reason to the benefit of the sole emotion makes a serene debate impossible. And the last point, and I didn't learn everything from Dominique Schnapper. It's not ironic, you know. It's I found your introduction very interesting. I learned things. But it's the passion of hatred. It's the passion of hatred. It's you just enjoy hating. Of course, Trump is a perfect model to that effect. But there's a journalist that did a wonderful paper, published a book maybe 20 or 30 years ago, which calls Au Front. And he was emerged in a section of the National Front, the far-right party. And he says they like to hate together. and we have a key that stops the debate from being possible. You know, the hating is what's good. That's what gives us that's our essence, in fact. It won't solve the problem of the inequalities or what have you, but it will give us a new dignity to hate, to show hatred.
Dans ce que vous dites, il y a
So there are many interesting things we'll talk about, but we'll keep on going and listening to the speakers first. Robert Leblanc, as a CEO, do you view that it's difficult to talk freely? Yes, it's difficult, and I'm worried, in fact, because what you said, Didier Duhamel, is the question of rationality. Can reason make a serene debate? Because there's violence in debate, but there's also violence without debate, because current societies are rather violent. If you saw what happened in Stuttgart, I don't know about the message. There was violence as some sort of a impulse that came out from a certain number of people, but I don't know how to call them because I'm not a sociologist. So I tried to prepare a speech on the question of reason. And in fact, I don't think that reason has a great place in the political debate. If we think of society, euthanasia, GPA, I'm not sure we can have a reasoned debate on the subject. It's about conviction. Some people think it's obvious to go ahead. Some people think it should be forbidden. So it's about subjectivity and conviction. The idea of truth is even a puzzle because the truth I believe in are probably not shared by everyone. No. Concerning the economy, maybe we can agree on mathematical laws that have been existed for a long time, but when it comes to the economists, most of them disagree. And when they want to be learned, they add psychology, sociology. Because the elementary market law are being questioned, have been questioned for a very long time. So if we want to interpret complex phenomenon, we have to use many parasites to the mathematic laws. Also, implementing such a system is not very easy. There are old-fashioned debates, change in thinking. Let's look at eco-tax. People thought they would be useful. We spent tolls. We spent money to implement them, and finally we didn't use them. So it's difficult to hope for serene debate under such circumstances. So as a CEO, I think that the key is respect. So, of course, when I hear what's been said about hatred and some sort of collective gathering about hatred, of course, this is hopeless. But I think that for a certain number of people who are not haters, we can work in the sense of respect. And it's not about formality, it's about deep respect. Let me give you an example. As a CEO, it's a story that dates back to 20 years ago, and we were talking with trade unions, and we were deeply opposed. But I looked at them and I said, but their ideas are worth mine, even though we don't share the same ideas. So I cannot assert that my ideas are better than theirs. And with such a viewpoint and such a respect, they could perceive that I had a peaceful and serene attitude to them, and we could move forward. Maybe I've gone through my 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop here. Okay, so thank you very much. We are handing the floor to Mexico with Marina Robles Garcia. We talked about France, the USA, Germany. Do you share the same concerns from your country, Mexico? Thank you, Jérôme. Hello, everyone. Hello to our colleagues and our listeners or viewers. I'd like to change a few themes you addressed with a different viewpoint, because I think that the themes of violence, injustice, lack of satisfaction are connected to processes that come from various origins. I think that some of the themes that were addressed are not necessarily integrated in the debate, especially the short-term debate. So I think that one of the problems that gave rise to such conditions, creating violent atmospheres due to injustice and violence, are connected to an economy that was thought, conceived with a logic of, well, with a short-term logic. And that created the downgrading of our ecosystems, social ecosystems. One of the points that lead us as a society is what happened with the work of the environmentalists that are cursed as Cassandra was in Greek mythology. Because Cassandra prophesied, well, she had the gift of prophecy, and it was given to her by Apollo because he was in love with her. And she did not have... He gave her the gift, but she was not in love with him, so he cursed her, saying that no one would believe her prophecies. And I think this is exactly what we are going through with the environment, because we've had information for the last 50 years showing and demonstrating that there were difficulties, but because we're following an economic logic, people tended to refuse these alarms. So I think that the pandemic might be something interesting for us. I'd like to come back to something Mr. Leblanc said, which is connected to reason. Because this is connected to a difficulty to understand and believe. The good or bad news that Cassandra might transmit to us, or that the environmentalist experts pass on to us. So as a society, maybe we did not see clearly or made mistakes on the way we communicate concerning the challenges we have to face throughout the world. Because we make decisions which are not always reasoned decisions. Because I believe we misunderstood one another, and we have to build new way of communicating so as not to be cursed like Cassandra was. Thanks a lot. I'm now going to hand the floor to Hervé SCHIAVETTI for the same modalities and the same question. Do you share this concern and this pessimism concerning the ways and means of the public debate? Well, concerning the downgrading of the public debate and the specific tensions that were born in the last months or years in terms of when there were protests in the streets, for instance, and when the monuments that symbolize the French Republic were damaged. It's a concern to me because Paris echoes what might be reproduced throughout the territory in Europe or all over the planet. So yes, I'm worried, of course. I'm not sure that the modern means of communication do not partake in this immediacy of the speakers without any diagnosis by many of our citizens. So we probably need more apprenticeship in the public debate. However, I'm deeply convinced, and this is what we saw with the Marseille election, municipal election, I believe that we need to change our system of representation. And even if it's only about representation, it allows us to address other moments in the political debate. And I believe, I think it would be possible for the main debates that are hot topics in our modern societies, it would be necessary to ask the questions such as questions for the environment, the insurance systems. We saw that after the COVID pandemic, because some people were not completely covered for their health. So I think it would be important to have rapid reactions, to have people from the right, the left, and the center, so that we can try and find proposals, even if those are not admitted by everyone as the ultimate solution. Sometimes within the territories, debates are not possible because they cannot lead to conclusions. For example, planning the motorways are questions, and we had to find a legal means to say that those structures are old-fashioned, and we need to find also new economies with business leaders, association representatives, and local players. It would be possible. Thank you, Hervé SCHIAVETTI, and thank you all because you respected the 5 minutes you had, so that we'll have half an hour to talk about what was said. So there are two questions I'd like to ask you, Dominique Schnapper. Are we condemned to a violent debate? Are we doomed to that? And how, under what circumstances, can we find some get-togetherness? Well, there's a risk in the democratic societies of the possibility of hatred, because those societies are competitive societies. And because they're open to everyone, because there's no access conditions to the goods you can benefit from, they naturally fuel a certain number of resentments and feeling of injustice. So it's a constant risk of the democratic society, because they say that equality is for everyone, and there is an openness of jobs for everyone, for instance. So it's a constant risk, and this risk translates in France, which is a very political country, is expressed on our political representatives. The hatred for our president seems to be utterly irrational. Of course, you can criticize public representatives, but there's some form of a hatred that might be linked to the fact that he symbolizes a success and that people feel humiliated compared to him. So today there are two things. First, time evolves more quickly, and there was something which created aggression because he was so smart.
Olivier DUHAMEL and Mr. SCHIAVETTI also talked about that. I'd like to hear your opinion on the accusation of social networks. We talked about the degradation of the public debate. Is it just an element among others, or is it a fundamental cause? Well, it's a complicated question. We tend to use a category of social networks. Sometimes we say social networks and continuous information channels, and the continuous information systems and the social networks are at the origin of all these degradations. It's not true. I think there are many other reasons, but they do have a role to play. But when we appreciate the role, well, it says the specific role of social networks, even if there are many, also in the social networks and the digital world, free access to internet for all, and obviously there are positive effects, but on politics, I think they're globally disastrous because I think they it's to the power of two, but everything's exaggerated, considerably exaggerated. It doesn't mean it's final and there's no way to fix this. No, I think that to pull out of a crisis, economists tell us we're heading towards an asymmetric V after a sharp drop. It will be slow, long, but it will improve. I would like us to pull out of the crisis on democracy, especially on the topic we're discussing here, by an asymmetric V. And I think there's a possible V curve. I think that if we play on different levers, that it's possible for things to improve. I follow Gramsci or Romain Rolland, but I'm still optimistic. On this topic of social networks, in the local politics, do these social networks in the recent years, in the last 10 years, for example, have they contributed to the degradation of the public debate? I wouldn't say degradation, I would say complexification. It's more complex. And we saw that during the last municipal elections where we weren't able to traditionally go to the marketplaces, visit people at their homes, or put posters and everything. But these direct exchanges using these same social networks involve some learning. Talk slowly, more slowly, so that you're well understood. Manage to organize complex thinking when you talk about balancing the municipal budget or the position of Marseille in the Bouches-du-Rhône department or on the Mediterranean. And so naturally, we have to, the first work to do is to learn how to use the tool, a little bit like we learned how to use printing and the books and the means that we had using printing through books. And I think that without a doubt, once we've learned, maybe we will be more careful and we will produce less hatred societally, notably against the elites, whether the economic, social, or political. Because I think that we need to protect legitimate thinking, whether it's social, political, or economical, so that democracy survives. You know, for us, it's very important. Us communists, you know, it's a very major stake to ensure the survival of complex democracies, and that lead to very little inequalities, but they're very strong for the relative value. Thank you. Robert Leblanc, I'd like to hear your reaction on one of the elements Maria Robles Garcia raised, that she called the Cassandra's curse, where in a world, and this is comes as an echo to the ecological anxiety that plays a role in this collective climate of hatred and the curse of Cassandra. Are we today ready to hear that the disaster is ahead of us? I'm talking to someone who knows this question of risks very well, because Aon is an insurance broker. Are we ready to hear about the disaster? I think yes. There's a majority of people who feel very comfortable in the idea of disaster rather than seeking solutions. But in your concerns, can you remain rational when faced with the idea that the disaster is ahead of us? No, I don't think we can be totally rational. We have figures on climate warming. The projections are just projections, forecasts. The explanations given are just explanations that are given. The virtue of all this is to encourage us to be cleaner, to be more sober, let's say, in our consumptions. But the basis on which they rely is they're not just the truth necessarily. To go back on social networks we talked about, they contribute to a confusion of knowledge. Everybody thinks, each and every person thinks that they hold the truth. Those who know are part of those who have the knowledge are part of the elites, and today they're discredited. And sometimes they contribute through the discordance, the disagreements we saw on the with the pandemics, you know, and the remedies. There was a petition that was signed in favor of a medication, a drug. You know, I can't be for or against a medication. You know, I think we have a multitude of change in attitude to try to have this asymmetric V curve. I like the IFOP Survey Institute. I think it's a scandal that they dared asking a question, is chloroquine an efficient drug or not? And so, do you believe in the efficiency? No, it wasn't, do you think? It wasn't, do you believe? It was, well, do you believe, you know, if you ask that question, that's credible. But no, it's, do you think? Do you think that the chloroquine is a good medication? No, it's terrible. It's there's one important element on what Mr. SCHIAVETTI said, and I don't necessarily agree, is that when he says we have to learn how these new tools work, you know, social networks. And the problem is even greater, and I talked with more competent people about these issues, and the millenniums, 20-year-olds, they perfectly know how to manipulate those tools. They perfectly understand how they function. So the problem is not to learn or to teach how to use them. The problem is to make them understand, to learn what a fake news is, how you make fake news. You have to learn in schools how to decipher images and fake news information. Because it's much more important than to learn the words of the Marseillaise national anthem. Because if you don't teach them that, they'll think that the national anthem is a fake news. So I'll go back on the rationality with a view faced with the disaster. I think there's a certain form of rationality The GIEC, for example, on the environment is rational. Each time they made a forecast, so we could assess what they had forecasted, and they were under what really happened. You know, so of course the science, the truth with capital T, but there's a series of partial truths and information on which we could base our policies. On medicine, for example, is more an art than a science, but there is scientific data. You know, I always said when I was defending science with my students, you know, nobody believes now that the Earth is flat. And yes, some people believe that. So the truth is, sometimes finds it hard to find its way, but there are rational results that are widely expected. But Robert Leblanc, you were too pessimistic, I think. It's true, if there's one topic on which the mentalities and the knowledge of has made progress, collective mentality is that one. You know, we do select the sorting of our waste. You know, in Gaul, and with the French who are against all that normally, and it's done rationally. So we have an opportunity to transfer a certain number of questions that are asked by the internet users, the participants to this economic encounters, the rencontres économiques. So one can take us to Mexico, to Marina Robles Garcia. Journal Le Potier is asking us via our website, what are your ideas to revigorate the democratic model? You were talking about the curse of Cassander, but in your position, with your responsibilities, very concretely, how can you reply to this? What can you do against this curse, and how can you ensure that this democratic model is better, as better tools to face this challenge and this violence and this hatred?
Algo alrededor de lo que me parece.
Before Jérôme, I would like to comment upon a point that the other speakers addressed. And the question was, do the social network trigger debate, and what sort of debate? I think their use was twofold. First, they were very useful to inform people. I think that in most social different groups, people have easier access to information. But I also believe that the social networks tend to exacerbate violence. Because, well, of course, they do not create debate, but the communication is at times very violent. Now, to answer the question you asked me, that's connected to an economic crisis, which is not far, but is connected to the economic development, the way we link to the economy that our systems are based upon. I think they engender a social crisis with a lot of injustice. And when we talk about Mexico City, one of the important issue is that the city is divided into two parts, in fact, even physically, because one part of the city is very wealthy. There are many job offers, very good schools. And then there's another part on the east side that's not as privileged. So we're trying to work with the ministry to try and rebalance those two parts of Mexico, the west and the east part of the city. So we're working upon access, cleanliness, because for many years there were huge differences between those areas. And we questioned question those issues so as to have a city that wishes to change the image the world has of the city, especially in the 90s, as an extremely polluted city. So we're heading for change. And this is why we adapted the way we work. And we worked with universities, with different sectors, so as to develop those strategies that would benefit the city. I'm going to ask the same question to you, Olivier DUHAMEL, because you said that we are probably condemned to a violent debate. Now, what solutions to try and find another way? What about the V solution you've been mentioning? So, I thought you were about to tell me about how to change Mexico City, and I was slightly worried. So maybe if we have to use one word, the key word would be education. If we don't understand that we have to change schools, we must be modern, we have to introduce tablets. You know, in this country for 3 months, people went to school virtually. Yes, but the fundamental question is not that of modernity, because the idea is not for them to be able to use such or such tool to go to such and such sites. The idea is to be able to resist fake news, to identify truth. If we do not teach this to our kids, then it's irrelevant. So to me, this is the absolute priority. Then also in the media, some things could change about the way we train journalists, but also, you know, the first time I realized the debate was impossible, and you won't like, the listeners might, half of the listener might not like me. It was in 2005 for a referendum for the European Constitution. And every evening I had a debate with people in favor of the no. And they said, they gave us fake information, saying we won't have a cultural exception, we won't be able to be independent. And I said, well, to excuse my French, but I said, fuck, I have to show them this is wrong. So I have to demonstrate this is wrong. So I spent my time telling them it was wrong. And then I understood I was completely trapped because I could not explain why we have to say yes, why Europe is a positive thing, because I'm being trapped I'm trying to dismantle the wrong assertion of the people facing me. And the job would have been the job of the moderator, in fact, and not mine. Now, concerning the yellow jacket, one I won't mention, Mr. Chalençon, the most violent of them all. He said, if there are dead people in Paris tomorrow, the blame will be on you. So this is all about violence and hatred. And I think for a peaceful debate to take place, the host of the debate should say, you should stop there. Dominique Schnapper. Yes, I wish to add to what Olivier just said, that the social network world is absolutely not controlled socially. And experience shows that without social control, where, you know, it's a world where everyone is anonymous, what prevails is hatred, and this is terrifying. Can I ask you a question as a former member of the Constitutional Council? Can there be a regulation or a law? Well, in fact, technique has overcome legislation we're trying to control, to limit, but technique is always ahead of the possibility of control. Concerning what's just been said, Robert Leblanc, and the idea of truth that is no longer, that the idea of a truth is no longer relevant. Yes, in fact, it's about the idea, because people had an idea of truth, and then they could assess what other people said because they referred to this concept of truth. Yes, it's a question of knowledge that's not respecting, because people believe they know everything with the social network. But on a radio, you can also ask any question to an anonymous citizen on very specific warfare questions. So I think we have to distinguish between feelings or opinion and knowledge. We can have an opinion on many things, but we need knowledge. And I think the social network tends to tone down both things. I liked also when you talked about humiliation of a person specifically, because I think this is something very important. Because this humiliation is a source of hatred, because those people lack respect. No, but who's humiliated? It is the people who knows, as opposed to the people who know, as opposed to the people who don't. Well, in fact, there's a lack of sobriety and a respect for the interlocutor, and there's jealousy. So I think that the idea of respect must work both ways. Respect for the people who know, respect for the people part of the elite. Because you're pronouncing the word, I have a question for Hervé SCHIAVETTI from one of our internet users. Don't you think debate is conflictual? Because when it's not, elite do not listen and just keep on going ahead. Hervé SCHIAVETTI. It takes us back to the yellow jacket, for instance. Well, concerning debate and conflict, I think it would be nicer to shift from the idea of conflict to that of tolerance. I suffered from this idea that at one point, the protest, the demonstration, be it social, economic, or human, was necessarily a transgressive act. Because demonstration is the possibility for an individual within a framework that is visible by everyone, the possibility to defend an idea. So there's a difference between a social conflict and the expression of social discontent. As the mayor of Arles, I suppose you went to roundabout during the Yellow Jacket demonstration. It was probably difficult to talk about tolerance with the protesters. In fact, they came to me with a town hall, and I said, what do you advocate? And they clearly said, I saw 5 different people, 3 of them came, and they said that we should ban the Marrakesh Agreement, and that Provençal should be imposed as a language. So I said I would not agree with this idea of condemning the Marrakesh Agreement. And the Mediterranean is an important question in Marseille and Arles. And I said that there's no way we will have some sort of a fake debate on are we in favor or against the Marrakesh Agreement. Because there was a debate at the National Assembly and in Europe. and we can talk within our families or when we talk with unions or politically, but we needed more information. And secondly, I thought it was unfair to impose Provençal, that is the regional language, as the only language because it was reductive. And it would not help to build collective space. So I thought that we would need political openings so as to reassert the place of their protest.
Je n'ai pas eu l'occasion.
So I didn't have the opportunity, they didn't come to rediscuss these matters, but I regret it is that we couldn't, from this moment on, to reintroduce a new debate in other rooms, other places, to be with them. I made the proposition, but they refused. They denied it because it was the simplification that for them was the most immediate, like for social networks, to make theirs a reality and use it to mobilize the far right, in fact, because today in the social networks or in the, you have the far right that expresses itself. And like in the Yellow Jackets, you have a few ideas that are not relative to tolerance or the progression of humanistic ideas that would enable to achieve a progressist republic. I think that with the Yellow Jackets, you have to fight against simplistic ideas that some use for political reasons. You know, it's not only the far right. Yes, it's a political claim, but it's of the far right, and I regret this quite a lot. I'd like to react on something that the swear words you used to against a person who didn't tell the truth in a debate on television. And I saw you really vigorously, you were really upset, and I wondered if there wasn't a problem of a dissymmetry in this debate between the truth and the fake news, facts and fake news, and that in the end the moderate people are not slightly left without weapons or without the proper tools. So shouldn't we be a little more violently moderate? You don't have to be moderate, or you can have a debate that's very lively. I think you said that you cannot have a serene debate. You talked about the MAP or euthanasia or surrogate motherhood. I don't agree with you. I think we can have a passionate but serene debate on MAP. But with a view to other subjects, these are topics on which incompatible ideas are mentioned, are used. But most of the time, you know, people discuss about this in a serene way. I'm not saying it's impossible. I said it couldn't be rational. It could be peaceful, but not rational. You don't need rationality to have a serenity or to have a serene discussion. You can have elements of rationality. You have a strong conviction, for example, but it's an element of rationality to say that one of the aspects of the debate is the perception you have of the family. When we talk about the MAP, for example. Or you can be rational by saying there's the right of the child. So you can have elements of rationality in the debate, and you can respect each other. I don't think there's an opposition between moderation and rationality. I don't think this is the proper wording. It seems that the democratic debate is among moderate people, those who are not in the absolute. No society is perfect. By definition, democratic societies are not perfect. They can be criticized, should be criticized, but we have to accept to be relative. You know, when you compare to other types of societies that we've known in history and space, And it has its values, it has its good and pros and cons, but the democratic practice are essentially of a moderate essence. Moderate in the expression, I agree, but we may not be moderate on the essence of the discussions. It can be more moderate in the form, or no, you can't oppose both. No, when you say it's a debate between moderate people, it's a debate in the expression, in the form, but not necessarily on the basis, on the. But we may not have convictions. It's not opposed, so I can defend the collective appropriation of production means with rational arguments and. No, since well, I'm sorry, they're all talking together. So there's the principle of the representative democracy. What we're discussing here, the idea of, and that's what's being questioned by the social networks, by those people who think they know everything. I think this moderation, we have it between elected representatives. Most of the time they respect each other, even they may have opposing ideas or opposing options, but they respect each other as people, as persons. But when the basic citizen expresses himself or herself on a social network, he or she don't have the respect of the others, and they can be much more radical, and they step out of the democratic debate. And that's why the measures to be taken, I've changed a lot. Maybe some people would disagree. I'm for. I think that's what would limit this feeling that we are excluded, that we express ourselves differently, more violently, and that's why we wouldn't have the impression of having a king that imposes everything, and that's one of the possible measures. And everybody's talking together. I'm sorry. So we're finishing in 3 minutes. Just to say that there are old debates that we could have again. No, one word. I'm afraid that the change in the polls, the votes, for us who study the Republican institutions, there won't be enough to give the citizens the feeling that they are properly represented. With the proportional or majority polls, you know, we have to find a medium position. Because unfortunately, this step that you are calling, that you're hoping for, is not catching with the populations in their relationships with the Republic. Unfortunately, they're not. So, but we were asked to give ideas, propositions, and this is one. So I would propose to Alain TRANNOY to put this in a nutshell, you know, just summarize all our discussions. So Alain, you've listened a lot, so what would be your conclusion? So in a nutshell, just to tell you that I think all the speakers, all the guests agree on the fact that the public debate is deteriorating. It's been for some time now. What are the reasons? Well, the reasons I noted Dominique Chaper's comment. She says that the democratic societies and liberal, in some way, organize the competition between different actors, between the citizens, and they are subject to deceptions that can lead to hatred, and maybe there's a fragility of our society based on competition and making people upset. And there are other reasons, political reasons. Obviously, there's a crisis of political representation in France. Dominique SCHNAPPER talked about the crisis of political representation in the U.S., and she gave good examples with the example of Trump and the rising of the fact that we consider that the political competitors are as enemies, and this is in line with the taking into account of populism, which is a political phenomenon that is based on the denial of the truth and prospers on deceptions. And with the media, we highlighted the role of social networks, the potential role of social networks. Relatively moderately, the guests are perceived social networks negatively. They seem to lean that way, but Olivier DUHAMEL gave the example or made a proposal according to which traditional media, with their search for audience ratings, they participate in encouraging the most extreme positions, because that's what will generate a buzz and bring a better audience rating and enable an economic balance. So it's encouragement. So the media is responsible. The mainstream media is responsible for part of the what we're faced with. So how can we, from the pit in which we are, how can we move towards an asymmetric V, the role of education, the role of schools, understand how fake news are made, and reinstore in schools that the idea of truth exists, even though it's difficult to capture. Eventually, the media, official media, mainstream media must, the role of the MCs, how we can, what ideas we can introduce in the public debate. And there's a disagreement between the two policies. When you talk about France, the change of the voting system could eventually manage to address this feeling of injustice, which is tied to the voting system, the election system. So thank you, Alain TRANNOY. So I'd like to thank our friends that were on video conference. So thank you for accepting the rules. Debate is more complex when you're distant. This made me think of something I read this morning, a very good newspaper, La Croix, and that is my paper in the collection Tract at Gallimard, the last issue signed by Etienne Klein, The Taste of Truth. The Taste of Truth, which explains the risk of talking with a great assurance on topics we don't know, on subjects we don't know. So I think you should, it's an interesting document. I recommend that you buy La Croix for people who are seeking the truth. And this is very much in line with our discussions here. So many thanks to all of you for taking part in this debate. And les rencontres économiques are continued after this. Thank you.